So in the project Dimensions of Diversity, Detroit, DC to Dubai, which is my personal journey, and I'm mirroring it, matching it up with conversations to help kind of share and illuminate issues of diversity, dimensions of diversity that we don't always think about, and doing so for the purpose of having you recognize and acknowledge that with a heightened awareness about dimensions of diversity, you can be proactive in the conversation for inclusion. See, diversity is what it is, and it's not so relevant in the workplace unless it's right next to the conversation for equity and inclusion. And what we're talking about there is saying diversity, diverse people, diverse thinking, people with different perspectives coming together, problem solving, project managing are just more highly effective when you bring different points of view and different angles of looking at the same thing, because people come from different backgrounds. And it's when homogeneity is present that you get kind of narrow-minded thinking, limited options, a lack of diversity that doesn't contribute to innovation. So one of the areas of diversity that I like to talk about is when I first got to Dubai, I was I had the experience of being, a minority, of being like, I don't belong, being in the underrepresented community, even though how it played out in one particular area. I worked in a healthcare facility. I was I think the only African-American woman and probably one of two Americans. And there was a sizable population of the administrative staff that were Filipino, and a sizable portion of the nursing staff that were Indian. And one of the cultural differences that I faced was the experience of being kind of this loud American, that the way I talked and the volume of I spoke, which is about this volume right here, was considered loud for some of those, for most of those people in those communities. And it wound up having me experience myself, like needing to restrain myself, needing to be constrained and a little suppressed, because I recognized that how I normally talked and the way I communicated and the amount of kind of leadership, assertiveness that I brought to how I talked and how I operated in just day-to-day conversations was what I would characterize as strong. And I got regularly was able to see where people were uncomfortable. And it's not that it wasn't personal. And it wasn't like, oh, we don't like Pam. She's like, it just was a difference in cultural experience, a difference in cultural upbringing that had me occur to them as loud and strong, and how they occurred for themselves and me too was kind of passive and meek. And while this wasn't true for every single body in each of the nationalities, it was a common enough occurrence that I had to actually be responsible for. I chose to be responsible for and manage how I communicated with people, and even my nonverbal communication, my body language and posturing. For instance, if I had to have a difficult conversation with someone, I made a point to have us both be seated at a table and talk it through. And I used the space of the table between us to manage some of the energy. I also had us seated because for a large portion of these staff members, I was significantly taller. And so just being aware of, the physical difference, which is another dimension of diversity, and wanting to not occur as dominating over them in order to have a productive conversation, especially if it was a difficult conversation, maybe, and the most common example was performance feedback, where I needed to address something that may not be working as well as we'd like it to. And I wanted to soften the environment for the conversation as much as possible. So I took responsibility for the tone of voice I used. I took responsibility for the volume at which I spoke. And I took responsibility for the physical environment. in order to manage what I like to call the kind of the people power dynamics, to help that person be as much at ease as possible, so they could hear me, so they could actually be in the conversation with me instead of kind of in their head, like, uncomfortable, afraid, kind of defensive, needing to self-protect, which is a really good example of what happens when people differ and the differences aren't accounted for. And I was able to really, I was able to be effective, and I was able to see the work there is to do to be able to be effective in communication. See, with dimensions of diversity, why it matters, one of the ways that it matters is that you want to actually be effective in communication. And if you're bringing a level of diversity or way of behavior, way of being that's different from that other person, how can you set the stage so that listening can happen, so that dialogue can actually happen, so that the person can be free to be in communication versus feeling intimidated, insecure, unsure? And it's a really great example of where understanding dimensions of diversity can help to ensure that inclusiveness is happening. See, the big part of all these conversations is if I've got to give feedback to someone and I want to contribute to them in their performance, they've got to be able to hear me. They've got to be able to ask questions about what they might not understand about what I'm saying. And they've got to be able to walk away with the substance of the conversation. And if they're more focused on the environment of the conversation, then the substance is lost, it's missed, its value is diminished. And that's a critical part why we really takes leadership to be responsible for dimensions of diversity. So we're going to have an ongoing conversation, dimensions of diversity from Detroit to DC to Dubai, my story, I'm sharing. Stay tuned, subscribe. See you soon.